Welcome everyone to our new Sci-Tech Asia webinar. And this is also the first webinar that takes us to Indonesia, which I'm very looking forward to. So our speaker today, Sunniva Sandbukt, is a PhD and also a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Digital Welfare and a member of the Technologies in Practice research group at the IT University of Copenhagen. Her research draws largely from economic anthropology and science and technology studies, and critically engages with the digitalization and private enclosure of social infrastructures. So I get to know Sunniva because we are sharing actually the same external examiner because our topics of research are so similar, but in different geographies. So I've been very looking forward to hearing more about this very fresh ethnographic research on digital economy in Indonesia. So I will just pass the floor to Sunniva.
Yeah, hi. Very nice of all of you to come to see this talk. I'm really excited to share it with you. I'm going to try and share this screen so you can see the slides. So can people just confirm that they can see the correct slide? Yes?
Yes, no? Very clear.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay.
Yes.
So thank you so much for the introduction, Jen. So this presentation is based on research from my PhD on how the dynamics of Indonesian apps, just a second, sorry, I'm sending a thing, yeah. Sorry, one more time. This presentation is based on research from my PhD on how the dynamics of Indonesian ride-hailing apps affect the circulation of money through integrated payment platforms of those apps. And before I start, I just want to give a quick shout out to the artist Nadia Rizky from Indonesia, who has produced a lot of the very beautiful artwork for both this presentation, but which is also a large part of the analysis of the thesis. So, one of the questions that I encountered a lot throughout my fieldwork in Indonesia was, would you like a top-up? And this question came in many variations from drivers of the ride-hailing platforms Gojek and Grab, who wanted to know if I would be interested in purchasing digital money for my account. In practice, the driver and I agree on a sum of money. The driver then uses the integrated payment mechanism of the app platform to make a digital money transfer to my account, and I give the driver the equivalent in cash. So I can now use my newly topped up balance to pay the next driver digitally rather than paying cash. And for those familiar with the more seamless digital transactions of similar ride hailing and food delivery apps such as Uber or Deliveroo, this moment of exchange between drivers and passengers may seem peculiar or cumbersome. Why not just pay the next driver with cash in the same way I am de facto paying cash to top up now? So most people in Indonesia don't use credit or even debit cards to make digital payments. And thus this way of storing money as credit in a digital form using a smartphone application is becoming increasingly popular. And such mobile-based transactions are sometimes referred to as peer-to-peer transactions, as they allow users to transfer digital money directly without using a bank. And in Indonesia, the ride-hailing platforms benefit from a fleet of on-demand drivers operating as exchange agents of this digital credit, and therefore also as sort of mobile extensions of the digital payment infrastructure, which is what we're going to talk about today. So therefore, this presentation is divided into 4 sections outlined here: examining the concept of peer-to-peer payments, understanding what digital money means in an Indonesian context, how hassle-free digital payments are experienced at the interface level, and finally, how these apps configure their consumers and drivers into a very specific transactional constellation. I just want to take a brief note on methodology before we move on to say that my research takes place in the city of Jogja in Indonesia. And I was there for 6 months in a time period between 2018 and 2019, just as digital payments were being popularized. And I engaged there in participant observation, as well as interviews with drivers, customers, the companies, and several peripheral stakeholders to this digital ecosystem. But I also want to point out that from a methodological point of view, I didn't actually consider the apps themselves to be central to my research. But throughout the fieldwork, I started to spontaneously capture screenshots of my experiences, such as the one depicted here. So the Gojek app in this screenshot had awarded me a token for completing a transaction, and I watched it spin in the app after swiping it until it had landed on a measly 6 Go points. A message immediately popped up telling me, "Did you know? You could have gotten up to 175 points if you had used GoPay." Of course, I should know better, right? I mean, even if I had opted not to pay in cash, the app algorithms likely would not have given me 175 points. I mean, they never did. I felt annoyed because I was being so blatantly manipulated by the app, its designers, successfully encouraging me into channeling more digital payments through it. Later in interviews, drivers also frequently shared screenshots with me to illustrate their points. And thus, I began to engage in a more rigorous practice of paying attention to the app interfaces to examine how the app's design was affecting my engagement with not just drivers, but with money itself. And so with apps taking over important social infrastructure, such as the circulation of money, novel ways of navigating the research affordances of these digital platforms must be developed. And I draw here on the work of Light et al. And the walkthrough method, amongst others. So what I found was that I wanted to get beyond the question of how people experience data in digital society to understand how the intentions of those creating it materialized in the infrastructures and interfaces to affect those experiences and shape behaviors. At the core of my fieldwork were two of the most prominent Indonesian digital payment apps at the time, GoPay and OVO. Both gained traction as the integrated payment mechanism of their respective ride-hailing platforms, Gojek and Grab, which is not Indonesian, but Singaporean. GoPay only exists as a digital wallet inside the Gojek app, but OVO started as a standalone discount platform for an Indonesian mall franchise, but can now also be found as the integrated payment system across various e-commerce platforms, such as Grab. Through fleets of what ride-hailing company vernacular refers to as driver partners, they've been able to convert customers of their transport service into customers of their financial services. Thus, in the Indonesian context, the emergence and increasing dominance of digital payment is intimately entangled with the use of ride-hailing apps and the labor of drivers. So, let us examine the concept of peer-to-peer transaction. And to do so, let me begin by describing an advertisement that Gojek released for Ramadan in 2016. In this advertisement, a young girl is asking her mother if she'll be home in time to break the fast for Ramadan that evening. Donning her distinctly green Gojek helmet, the mother gives her a small package, telling her to open it when she breaks the fast. We see multiple clips of the mother driving passengers to and fro. It's hot, she's tired, and all these customers are cranky and rude. Her final passenger is taking food to an orphanage for Ramadan, and as she watches all the happy children, the mother smiles despite everything. Meanwhile, her daughter opens the gift, a box of dates, alone. It contains a card from her mother apologizing because they cannot be together. The reason, she explains in the note, is that mom needs to make sure everyone else gets home in time to celebrate. Finally, alone on her motorcycle and having her first drink of water, the mother receives several messages as customers send grateful thanks and positive ratings through the app platform. Firstly, this advertisement presents the imagined participants in the exchange as two overarching categories of user for the platform, the service provider and the service customer. Secondly, besides the green helmet, the company itself is hardly present. In fact, the app's role as an intermediator of this exchange only becomes apparent towards the end when the phone makes its first appearance. Instead, the advertisement emphasizes how the users are social equals who are helping each other out in an important social, cultural, and religious event. What it does not emphasize is the precarity of the single mother who cannot be home since she must work long hours. Instead, it almost seems as if she's doing this work out of a sense of social responsibility towards her peers. Notably, money is never seen nor mentioned. The word peer itself, of course, has a specific meaning and generally refers to a person or object of equal status or rank to someone or something else. I am particularly interested in how the phrase peer-to-peer, a term from computing, came to describe an economic transaction, and how the retention of the term peer in this context imbues the expression P2P payments with certain social meanings. Firstly, various definitions of the word peer are all characterized by the critical underlying trait, that being a peer is something that can only be defined in relation to something else. Secondly, all uses imply a sense of equality within the peer relation, whether this is socioeconomic or computational. So originally used to describe a non-hierarchical network topology, the phrase peer-to-peer or P2P is now commonly used to describe diverse types of digital value transaction by financial technology companies. Most famous is M-Pesa, a form of mobile money originating in Kenya that allows users to top up their phone credit balance through a network of agents and send this credit to others, who can then cash it out through the same agent network. And this type of digital transaction is usually characterized as peer-to-peer because it allows people to transfer money to each other without the use of a bank. A practice greatly valorized by the fintech industry for creating access to important financial services normally inaccessible to poor or socioeconomically marginalized people. I'm particularly interested in how the phrase came to describe an economic transaction, as I mentioned earlier. Therefore, Ria and Nelms describe P2P as the primary use case of mobile money, a peer-to-peer transaction where one person transfers a form of digital value to another. The language of peer-to-peer is prominent within the use of commercial digital wallets and perpetuates this idea of mutual exchange in accordance with the P2P ideal of a flat, symmetrical, or egalitarian relationship without an intermediary. But as Ria and Nelms point out, this transaction to someone has to happen through something, through hardware, services, networks, app interfaces, agents, and third parties, the intermediaries of the transaction. Thus, rather than interpreting the to as a numerical representation of the direction of the transaction, it might serve an analytical purpose to consider it a placeholder for the intermediaries through which the digital transaction travels. The simplistic representation of the directional transaction implied by the P2P acronym provides a superficial rendering of the complex exchange relationships it contains. It might be useful instead to understand the term as a relational acronym, where the so-called peers on either side of the exchange have their own relationship as well as relationships to the intermediaries. The use of the phrase peer-to-peer rather than, for instance, user-to-user undeniably also introduces an implicit social meaning to the exchange relationship. In the context of P2P and network nodes, peer is used as an alternative to the hierarchical arrangements of a client and a server. But what is the equality implied in the P2P of payments? Are they peers of equal social status? Is it that they are accessing the same resource or are presumed to have the same capacity for operating the technology? Is it within the configurations of the technology that they are defined as equal peers? Or is this peerhood one that emerges when all other aspects of their social context are removed, leaving only equality because everything but the fact of the exchange itself has been stripped away? I suggest that the use of the term P2P confuses not only these complex relational dynamics, but also obscures the power that the intermediaries exert in configuring the conditions of exchange relationships of the alleged peers. So in science and technology studies, we talk about how the emergence of a technology must also entail the emergence of the user. And rather than being a specific person, the user is a composite character, a sort of caricature of what actions those designing the technology imagine its future users to make. A peer is, of course, also a user of a technology, but the term peer introduces additional dimensions to the person and perhaps requirements from the technology. After all, how would you configure for peerhood? By thinking about how these self-declared neutral platform companies configure their users into exchange relationships, we can really begin to unpack the effect of the technology on the many P's and Q's within the digital payments in Indonesia. So, in order to examine how these apps work and are experienced in practice, we need first to understand a few things about the existence of digital money in Indonesia. Firstly, it's important to address the fact that Indonesia has been going through massive economic growth since political and economic instability in the late 90s. But though the poverty rate has fallen, income and wealth inequality is growing rapidly. Presently, the richest 4 men share a combined wealth of more than the poorest 1 million. Thus, despite economic developments, many people still do not have or use a bank account. The government has initiated multiple projects to increase so-called financial inclusion, and in 2019 declared that over 75% of the population now had access to a bank account, a critical step in overarching public policies to becoming a less cash society, as the National Bank calls it. So for most Indonesians, digital payment has generally meant using a debit card to make a payment at a shop, or an ATM card, which, aside from making withdrawals, allows users to access their bank accounts to make transfers at an ATM. For most of the people I spoke with, the emphasis was not on digital money itself, but on the ability of the ATM to transition money between digital and tangible states as needed. Within the population that has access to a bank account, only a minority also own a credit card. According to the Global Fintech database, only 2.4% of the adult Indonesian population had a credit card in 2017. For those who can pay by card, this is the type of view that might meet you in a store or a cafe. Despite increasing interoperability between banks and payment providers, customers using infrastructures from banks other than their own can still face substantial fees. And therefore, each bank needs its own EDC terminal, as can be seen in these pictures. So whereas digital money is stored in your bank can be mobilized using a plastic card, electronic money, or e-money, was given a distinct legal definition in 2009 as a type of digital credit balance issued and stored by a private actor. So e-money is issued based on the equivalent value of state-issued money deposited by a holder to the issuer. It is stored electronically in a media, such as a server or a chip. It is used as a means of payment to a merchant, which could be a shop, cafe, or of course, drivers. E-money is what apps like GoPay and OVO provide access to. It's a type of debt that Gojek or OVO issue to you, in which they repay you when you use the app to pay one of their affiliated merchants, effectively by transferring your credit record to the record of the merchant, after which it can be withdrawn again as cash. And while the use of e-money has been rapidly increasing these past years, as can be seen to the left, it is worth noting that the amount of money being transacted in this way pales in comparison to the more conventional ATM debit transactions, as can be seen on the right, which is worth keeping in mind when we talk about the hype of e-money in these contexts. At least for now, and when this data was taken, we're talking about smaller value transactions. So when the discourse surrounding digital payment emphasizes the phrase cashless or less cash, as advocated by the Indonesian government, we obscure what it is that these cash transactions are being replaced by. As digitalization draws attention to the underlying infrastructures of money, particularly the concept of payments has received renewed academic attention. When you make a digital payment, what you are doing is requesting the entity which keeps your record of accounts to alter that record and the record of the person you're making the payment to. And this generally takes place through banks and various third-party payment processors. Thus, what happens in a cashless or less cash society is the centralization of control over payment infrastructure. Where cash can be considered a public, state-issued social infrastructure, digital payments are generally the domain of private entities. And though the money transacted through the Gojek app may be denominated in the state-issued Indonesian rupiah, these tokens are contained within and transported through this private infrastructure. Thus, these apps not only determine the price to be paid, but the price of making the payment itself, as we will see shortly. For the intermediaries processing digital payments, the value in providing payments infrastructure shifted with digitalization, from imposing fees or rent in exchange for the service of moving money to the value of the transactional metadata itself. So when I purchase things through the Gojek app, I let the app and its owners know where I like to shop, what I like to buy, who I like to buy from, what my transport routes are, and what I'm willing to spend. Where cash is anonymous, usable only by whoever's holding it, digital money becomes hyper-personalized. The digitalization of money has facilitated an unprecedented aggregation of this transactional metadata. Thus, to quote economic anthropologist Bill Moore, for intermediaries, the dream is for a system where value enters a network and circulates endlessly, never leaving as material cash. For Gojek, the self-declared goal is to become a super app, an app that provides for all of a customer's wants and needs by hosting other apps within the overarching umbrella of a single platform. As the head of the Gojek data engineering team writes on the company blog, the biggest moat Gojek built is payments. Once you're handling money for a user, you can build a castle of services within it. This moat is comprised of the digital credits issued privately through the GoPay wallet. And purchased using Indonesian rupiah, these GoPay credits can be used exclusively for services accessed within the Gojek platform. Thus, it is Gojek that controls the metaphorical drawbridge, which gives both access to and confines money, services, and people within these moats' boundaries. And it is this expansion from a ride-hailing app into the center of our socioeconomic exchange practices and the subsequent dynamics that these platforms introduce to the circulation of value that deserves increased scholarly scrutiny. Where cash can be exchanged from one hand to another, digital money requires more infrastructural support, such as QR codes or EDC terminals. And much of this infrastructure is actually rendered invisible by design, thus allowing users to pay without hassle, the underlying infrastructure concealed within frictionless aesthetics. So let's go for a little walk inside this friction and hassle-free castle. When you open either the Gojek or Grab app, this is the home screen that greets you, or at least it was when I was doing fieldwork. In both apps, the digital wallet appears as a menu bar at the top of the screen, which shows you your balance denominated in rupiah, 22,999 in this picture. The menu allows you to top up or to make payments and lures you in with a promise of more features, only to reveal that you have to be a premium user to access features like withdrawing your money or sending money to other people. Thus, for regular users, money stored in the app can only exit again in the form of payment. If you want to top up your balance, the app specifically asks you to make a payment using a debit card. In other words, you are buying GoPay credits, not unlike how you would buy a gift card for a favorite shop. For those without a debit card or a bank account, the app provides very detailed instructions for a variety of alternative top-up methods. First and foremost, suggesting that you ask your driver for a top-up, which is also the only free way to do so. As a customer, the main way to interact with this digital wallet is when the app asks you to select a payment method for in-app purchases. In these images, we see me selecting a payment method for a car booking in Grab. To the left is the price of the trip if I choose OVO, the digital credit. But as I don't have enough OVO balance, I have to select the cash option. Noticeably, the price changes from 4 to 20,000 rupiah. The interface design also deploys color using green to show how good and cheap the digital payment option is compared to the neutral black used for cash. Even worse, having selected cash, a red notification bar appears at the top of the screen, reminding me that I'll be missing out on an 80% discount for not choosing OVO. Thus, the presence of the digital payment option is not just presented as a convenient or neutral alternative to making a cash payment. And this is just one example of how both apps aggressively encourage users to pay digitally, to the point that one almost begins to feel punished for choosing cash. And this affects how people use the apps. By 2019, I was constantly comparing discounts across apps, and I found myself taking every opportunity to ensure that my accounts were topped up to avoid feeling as though I was missing out on a cheaper trip and thus wasting money. Similarly, for most of my interlocutors, the real value proposition of e-money was not the fact that it is digital. It is the ability of this form of money to provide access to cheaper services and products. So what the apps primarily give is an instant access point for the type of purchases that are associated with a middle-class life: personal drivers, discounted food delivery, and cashbacks when shopping at the mall, as you can see in this picture, where 3 different apps are competing for the same customers in one restaurant. So how do drivers fit into this digital money ecosystem? Well, let me begin with describing one of my earliest encounters with some unexpected transactional friction in 2018. I had just downloaded the Gojek app and topped up my GoPay wallet and was trying to use this money to pay for a cappuccino in a neighborhood coffee shop. Belum bisa, a barista told me when I asked if I could pay for my order with GoPay. You can't yet. I had selected this coffee shop from my neighborhood because I had seen it listed in the GoFood section of the Gojek app, and so I had assumed the digital wallet would be an acceptable form of payment. The coffee shop only accepted cash, the barista explained. But if I wanted to use GoPay, there was a way of doing so. I could make an order for my coffee using the GoFood tab in the Gojek app and select the digital payment option rather than cash upon checkout. A Gojek driver would receive my order, drive to the cafe, place the order, wait for it to be prepared, and then pay for it using their own cash. The driver would then bring me the coffee and be paid for both the cost of the coffee and their time using my GoPay balance. This was my first encounter with the entanglements of online drivers and digital money in Indonesia, and my first confounding experience with the peculiar limitations and opportunities of transaction that had materialized from the app's interface. When I first started using these apps in 2018, I assumed that drivers and customers shared the same digital wallet infrastructure. After all, if I was paying them with my GoPay wallet, it seemed natural to assume they were receiving it in their GoPay wallet. In practice, however, drivers use a separate app that contains 3 digital wallets, as can be seen in this image. Firstly, a credit wallet from which the company extracts their 20% cut of income from trips paid with cash. Secondly, a cash wallet used to store income from digital payments. And finally, the consumer wallet, GoPay for Gojek drivers and OVO for Grab drivers, to which they could transfer their earnings directly and access them through the consumer version of the apps. Now, for this income to be useful, drivers can make a request to the app to cash out their balance. The company then debits their account and transfers money to the driver's bank account, and only then can the drivers withdraw the money as cash at an ATM. Notably, this means that contrary to customers, all drivers must have a bank account. And if they don't have one, Gojek provides them with one through their partnership with Bank Sentral Asia, the largest privately owned bank in Indonesia. Truly, banking the unbanked in order for the customer to experience hassle-free and heavily discounted cashless payments. When a driver tops up a customer balance, what they're really doing is selling their own digital balance and receiving cash in exchange. The apps incentivize drivers to do this, either by awarding them points, which count towards their daily bonus targets, or by giving them a digital cashback of up to 20% of what they sold, as you can see here, where the driver has received 4,000 as a bonus for completing a top-up. One driver proudly shared that he would nudge customers to buy a top-up, securing himself cashbacks of up to 100 or 150,000 just for selling his balance, implying sales of between 500 to 750,000 rupiah per day. Curious, I asked the driver what his strategy was for maintaining such high liquidity in his digital account. He argued that for the most part, it was not a problem since customers were constantly replenishing his account by paying through OVO, just as I had in fact done for this trip. Incidentally, I had just asked him for a top-up equivalent to the exact cost of the trip because, as described earlier, I too was concerned with maintaining a digital balance. Basically, I had made a 20,000 cashless payment using OVO to access a discounted trip, and then proceeded to use the same amount of cash to replenish my digital account in preparation for the next trip. As a reward for selling his OVO balance to me, the driver later receives 4,000 rupiah as a cashback to his digital wallet. From the driver's point of view, he had received my digital payment, then sold me the same amount back, receiving 20,000 in exchange, but also receiving a digital 4,000 from the company. In total, the driver earned 24,000 rupiah, but in the process managed to convert 20,000 of his existing balance into the more useful form of cash. The irony of this cash-filled cashless transaction was not lost on the driver. Uang memutar, he laughed. Money goes around. It was not an atypical exchange, he explained. Like me, many passengers chose to top up on each booking, opting for smaller and more frequent top-ups rather than maintaining a larger digital balance. So for drivers, selling balance to customers like that represents an important alternative way to cash out because accessing an ATM can be quite inconvenient. By selling their balance, drivers instantly convert digital assets into cash without having to wait for the transfer to be processed by the system. Meanwhile, the e-money tokens continue circulating within the system, and the company never has to make a bank transfer to the driver. Operating on the front lines of the digital economy, these drivers are thus doing the persuasive work of bringing new customers into the digital payment ecosystems of these apps on behalf of the companies they work for. Drivers are converted into on-the-go digital ATMs for customers, but they also use customers as an on-the-go cash ATM service for themselves. Because drivers need cash, and therefore it is they who incur the hassle of having to rematerialize digital money into cash. Thus, in this system, drivers are the ones who take on the frictions, risks, and transaction costs of facilitating a hassle-free digital payment ecosystem. And this becomes particularly clear if we examine the moment of topping up in more detail. So these screenshots show up a top-up transaction that I had with a Grab driver. Once my booking is accepted by the driver, the app covers most of the map with an unclosable splash screen with a dominating green button, encouraging me to top up my balance with the driver. After clicking the button, the next screen informs me that I can request between 10 to 320,000 rupiah from the driver, and it gives me the option to enter a figure. The app now shows me a comforting image with a sparkling green check mark. My request has been successfully submitted. In the car, the driver reaches for his phone and almost instantly a new splash screen appears on my screen, telling me that the top-up has been successful, and I hand the cash to the driver. There are a few things that the customer does not see in this interaction. Firstly, when the app tells me how much money I can request, the number it is showing is the entire contents of the driver's digital cash wallet. Secondly, the driver does not, in fact, have the option to decline this transaction. In the driver's version of the app, at least at this point in time, the splash screen that appears gives him simply the option to click a similar green button which reads Collect Money. The button doesn't even say Confirm Transaction. Once requested by the customer, the transaction is inevitable and there's no meaningful agency here for the driver. Such design may not have any malicious intent, but it reflects neglect, revealing that the contents of a digital wallet do not truly belong to the driver until they have been withdrawn as cash. Instead, the wallet is there to enable customers to access and make use of the company-issued digital credit. So, having examined how payments and digital money work in practice, let's shift our focus finally to how the app arranges its customers and drivers, configuring them into the roles of consumer cyborg and driver partner. To begin, let's zoom out a little bit from this particular castle and its moats and examine some of the arguments perpetuated by the financial technology industry in the promotion of their products. Now, don't worry too much about reading all of these quotes. Let me just summarize them a little bit. They're all regarding the Indonesian fintech industry or from actors in that industry. Publicly, these companies perpetually make the argument that their financial technologies will lead to financial inclusion of those who are unbanked by bringing millions of people into the digital economy as members of a cashless society. And globally, this is a very dominating narrative surrounding these types of P2P payments. And in my thesis, I trace this line of thinking, examining the global paradigm shift that led to perceiving the world's poor as a new and exciting market opportunity. There, I provide a critical analysis of how these arguments are mobilized in favor of expanding these private money services, often with support from national governments, as is the case of Gojek and the Indonesian state. It is presumed in this thinking that by giving a poor person access to financial services or to selling their products and services on a platform, they will be able to generate income and thus lift themselves out of poverty. But this ignores the complex structural dynamics that lead to socioeconomic inequalities, such as the increasing income and wealth disparities in Indonesia. And a similar type of logic casts ascendance to the middle class as a personal responsibility, which in turn construes being afflicted with poverty as a personal failing. these are stigmatizing moral judgments which lead to the legitimization of exploitation of those deemed less financially responsible or diligent. A critical thing to remember, therefore, is that participation in a cashless economy is not a universal experience. A technology that makes life more convenient for some can greatly complicate the lives of others. In practice, these Indonesian apps reproduce specific ideas about consumption that are at odds with the visions of the marginalized and unbanked populations that these same actors argue that their apps will benefit. They reveal a certain positionality of both the developers, their investors, and their imagined consumer. Particularly, these visions reproduce ideas about the modern Indonesian middle-class lifestyle and the type of aspirational consumption that can demarcate you as having these forms of social capital, as illustrated in this Gojek advertisement for their new Pay Later service. It's worth noting that a central component in how the middle class constitutes itself is through the employment of others, publicly demonstrating the forms of affluence that allow them to pay others to do things for them. Driver partners, notably, are not employed by these apps, but they are mobilized in service of the app's customers and by extension, the digital economy through the platform infrastructure. So as I point out in my thesis, loosely organized drivers known simply as Ojek have existed long before Gojek or Grab. And what these companies have done is impose themselves over an existing social infrastructure and provided customers with an easily interpretable interface for engagement. And in doing so, their platforms create momentary stabilizing parameters for exchange, thus controlling the conditions of the transaction that was already taking place without them. And proponents of the gig economy and these forms of digital capitalism often argue that this is a type of labor that makes workers more flexible, more able to exert control over their lives. But arguably, it makes it more flexible to be the employer. In practice, with Gojek and Grab, anyone can easily and flexibly employ a temporary servant, perpetuating what scholars Ray and Kayum conceptualize as cultures of servitude, social relations of domination and subordination through which subsequent dependency and inequality are normalized and reproduced through everyday social interaction. This division in who is being served and who is doing the serving is most eloquently expressed by Gojek's founder, Nadiem Makarim himself. During a 2019 fireside chat at an industry event in Bali, Makarim makes an interesting observation about the app he helped create, calling Gojek the operating system of the real world. Makarim elaborates, "You're creating a cyborg in our consumers that are able to not have to do the things that they don't want to do, and therefore have more time to get stuff done in life." Implicit here is the logic of automation, which reduces the time spent on a process. Through this automation, the app, the phone, and the driver who is tasked with doing those things for you all become a part of your extended cyborg self. It is interesting that the emphasis here is on how the app can serve those similar to Makarim himself. His emphasis on productivity, efficiency, on not having to waste your own time when someone can waste theirs for you, feels remarkably revealing of his worldview and his orientation as one of the app's consumer cyborgs. Characterizing what problem he feels Gojek is trying to solve in the world, Makarim says, "It was simply a problem of mobility, right? How do you get a human, an object like food or money or value to move in the fastest possible, cheapest, most convenient way using one tool?" Makarim's answer is the app. But the app itself does not result in the rapid, cheap, and convenient circulation of people, objects, and value. That circulation is facilitated by the human labor performed by the driver partners. So when Makarim uses language to cyborg or operating system of the world, he foregrounds technological innovation and reinforces the idea of a seamless automated process by which this circulation takes place almost magically. Here, the driver partner is positioned in service of the consumer cyborg, the intended user of the app, and beneficiary of its cashless payment system, quite contrary to the P2P ideal of a flat or egalitarian exchange relationship. Gojek and Grab are, of course, not the only companies that refer to their fleets of drivers as driver partner, a title that demarcates a different type of relationship than someone employed to work for the company. And it was not uncommon for drivers, when I interviewed them, to express discontent with the conditions of this alleged partnership. They were partners with the app company who relied on each other for income, yet they were not equal parties. When drivers sign up, they accept the terms and conditions that come with working as an online driver. However, as many have pointed out, those conditions frequently change without warning or consultation with the drivers. There is no two-way negotiation. They experience that the apps define them as on-demand robots, their labor mobilized and channeled through the app infrastructure to serve the needs of the consumer cyborgs, and ultimately the financial interests of the companies. As one driver responded when I asked him what word he would use instead of driver partner: servant, probably. In practice, the social relationships, the alleged transactional peerhood of these apps, is heavily mediated by algorithms which lead to the formation of new transactional hierarchies. In the final chapter of my thesis, I go into detail to document how drivers experience being mobilized as on-demand servants through these platforms, but I'll touch on just a few here. So firstly, driver income is calculated by a set kilometer tariff, which does not include distance to the customer or time spent in traffic. This is supplemented with a daily bonus from the companies. And drivers earn points for each completed trip, hoping to reach the highest of 3 tiers to reach the maximum bonus, as illustrated in these pictures. Furthermore, the design of this system makes it so that the economic value of the points earned in the final tiers is worth much more than the first tiers, meaning drivers are incentivized to be available for as long as possible to maximize points earned. Critically, drivers don't receive their bonus if they cancel more than 25% of trips. Though they may have good reasons for doing so, falling below the euphemistically titled productivity rating means that they incur what they call a debt trip, meaning they must complete more orders in order to bring the productivity rating up while the company holds their bonus hostage. Meanwhile, customers are encouraged to rate their experience after each trip. From the customer interface point of view, rating a driver between 1 to 5 stars is a question of a few millimeters and a thumb swipe. But for drivers, this transaction is a source of constant anxiety because less than 5 stars will ruin their algorithmic ranking. And many offer customers drinks or snacks to engage in other forms of relational work as a way to ensure good ratings. In a worst case scenario, a customer might give a driver a 1-star rating, leading to an automatic suspension. And for drivers, this can be a temporary or permanent loss of income, but critically, some drivers also pointed out to me how it affects their access to the digital wallets and their savings, which of course are also controlled by the app which employs them. Access to the digital wallets of the apps is further complicated for those drivers who rely on account vendors to register outside of the formal Gojek system. I first became aware of vendors when drivers would decline selling me their balance, saying there was no money because they were with a vendor. What I came to realize is that vendors manage fleets of drivers using an app infrastructure that I was told they were provided by Gojek. And digital earnings made by drivers have to be manually transferred to the driver's bank account each day. According to 2 employees of a vendor that I interviewed, Gojek provides them with a window for transfers Monday through Fridays between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. With an estimated 250 active drivers requiring daily transfers within a 5-hour window, the 2 employees only have about 2.5 minutes each per driver, and thus mistakes are quite frequent. And as they transfer the daily earnings, they make sure also, of course, to withdraw their own 5% cut of the digital earnings. So there's a hierarchical difference here, not just in income, but also access to and control over earnings between those drivers who are registered directly with Gojek and those who rely on the additional intermediation of vendors. More critically, in March 2019, Gojek codifies a system of unequal pay for go-kart drivers in Jogja, at least, as go-kart drivers woke up to an in-app notification of a change to the incentive bonus system, which radically worsened their conditions for labor. Gojek replaced the standard 3-tier bonus scale with a system using 4 different scales, known as schemas A, B, C, and D. Briefly, Schema A required fewer points and therefore completed trips per tier, but also reduced the maximum bonus they could earn, whereas Schema D required more points but gave the highest maximum bonus. Which schema each driver is assigned was determined by how many trips they had completed in the past 2 weeks, meaning taking days away from driving could affect your income for several weeks in the future. Some drivers speculated that other performance indicators, such as customer ratings, order cancellation, or even how much they turn their apps on or off, might also affect these algorithms. The result is that the drivers experience that the value of their labor fluctuates depending on what schema they have. Because even if 2 drivers both complete 20 trips, driver A will only receive the reward for 10 points. They will not be compensated equally for the same work. And these changes to the schema were a really prominent part of my discussions with drivers in 2019. Notably, some drivers, despite their own exasperation and frustrations with the system, would differentiate Schema A to me as being for lazy drivers and Schema D for drivers who were diligent. Thus, they were also reproducing the same moral judgments that legitimize the exploitation of the poor in service of the middle class. So, to summarize, the idea of P2P payments leverages the social meaning and positive connotations of social equality associated with the word peer, obscuring underlying power asymmetries between the exchanging parties, as well as the power that these companies exert as they define the conditions for exchange within the digital infrastructure. Furthermore, the socially acceptable concept of peer-to-peer ultimately conceals the fact that this constellation is a transactional arrangement that is valuable to the corporation. Users of the apps, no matter if they are drivers or customers, are tools for the platforms because their transactions lead to the circulation of both money and data, which is where profits are derived. Thus, for the companies, the emphasis is not on creating equal conditions for exchange, but on securing continued customer engagement. And this is done by providing cheap and convenient services through the platform, which depends upon the exploitation of labor and the displacement of the transaction costs of digital payment onto drivers. This exploitation and extraction of value from transactional metadata are what is camouflaged in the language of P2P and financial inclusion. Companies such as Gojek and Grab continue to receive a lot of attention for how they are revolutionizing the economy through digital technology, or how they're automating existing systems and empowering drivers by formalizing their service. Meanwhile, they're growing into super apps, hoping to be the main gateway for accessing and paying for services in Indonesia and neighboring countries in Southeast Asia. They've attracted massive amounts of international venture capital from those wanting to be a part of or beneficiary of this digital transition, as the companies extend their monopolization of customers and transactional metadata. A few months ago, just after I handed in my thesis, Gojek announced a merger with another Indonesian e-commerce company called Tokopedia. They formed the on-the-nose consortium called Go2. Their stated goal is to be a publicly listed on stock exchanges in both Indonesia and the USA with an estimated value of up to $40 billion US. Meanwhile, in Jogja, drivers are chasing points late into the night, stressing about managing their digital balances and worrying that customers might report them for driving a borrowed account. Gojek and Grab may argue that their digital technologies will alleviate these problems and provide the poor and disadvantaged with alternatives to conventional financial services. In practice, however, as the companies chase profits and market monopolization, the structure of this money system reinforces socioeconomic hierarchies and attempts to further enclose people within the moat of digital payments. And that is my presentation for you today. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
This is a wonderful talk. Could I ask you to maybe turn off the screen sharing so that we could see each other in the audience?
There we go.
For anyone who wants to ask a question, please just raise your hand or just type in the chat box. So while you might be still thinking about the question, I would take the liberty as the host to ask one. So this is actually very interesting because when I was talking to Sunniva about this research earlier, I didn't realize how special it is, that the driver is actually used as the medium for this cash out exchange. And I was actually wondering why you think that, among all those kind of, sectors that the digital payment infrastructures could be built in around, why this e-hailing apps are the ones that are doing this type of work. Because, for example, in China, the e-commerce platforms are the first ones to naturally actually come into the digital payment business, and then the business will become the infrastructures for all those kind of e-hailing platforms and stuff. So I was wondering, is it has something to do with the fact or with the roles of the drivers in the society? Because the drivers are also, the kind of driving the vehicles for people. And as you said, those apps are actually maintained. Those promises of these apps are maintained through actually human labors. But actually, I would say that for example, our whole promise of mobility in society as a citizen in a capitalist world, it could also be maintained by the similar types of laboring, such as the drivers who drive the taxis for us. So I was wondering how and maybe why you think that that's the case in Indonesia.
Such a good question, and it's actually our mutual friend Bill Maher was asking me the similar question about how he found it interesting how these two apps represent some pretty like normal experiences if you spend a lot of time, at least in like urban Indonesia, which have to do with going to the mall, which is where OVO came from, and spending time in traffic, which is where GoPay comes from, and sort of how that's a unique origin point, which I would love to actually explore and write a bit more about concretely. Why I think it evolved like this, I mean, these are not the only apps that exist, right? I think at the moment, or when I finished this research in 2020, there were about 55 registered digital wallets in Indonesia. And the first ones that came about actually were from the telcos. So not dissimilar to, for example, M-Pesa. There was a huge regulatory change that came in 2017, where the fintech sector was actually, from what my informants told me, were in conversation with at least legislative authorities to try and enact a much broader sort of policy package for the area, because they found that it was quite under-regulated. And that led to many people losing their licenses. So Grab actually originally had their own service, but they lost their financial license, was my understanding from this time, which is why OVO became their partner. So that was a major event in 2017, and we see that it's the amount of people who have wallets since then has skyrocketed. And I didn't show any of that data in this presentation, but it's in my thesis if anyone wants to look at it. So what are the drivers? I think the drivers provide this really unique point of access, right? Because they're already sitting there and chatting to people. They already have other forms of relations as well. Like you would trust a driver to tell you where to go and get some nice food, for example. And so the drivers that I talked to, I didn't go so much into detail with it here, but they mobilize a lot of persuasive argumentation to these customers themselves because they are incentivized by the company. So you have this very special, unique access point to get people to put in just small sums of money. And they're not making the argument like with M-Pesa, like, oh, you can send this money to your relatives. They're making the argument that you can use this to make your trip cheaper. Drivers will literally say that, oh, why aren't you using digital money? It'll be cheaper if you do. That's the same argument that is underlying this sort of infrastructure. Yeah, so I think that's why, like, there was another one, T-Cash was kind of prominent, which was one of the telcos, the Telkomsel, one of the biggest Indonesian telco companies. And they were trying to put forth a system where people would have a little like sticker on their phone that they could tap with an NFC sensor in it. And that kind of died around 2018 and became merged into something called Link Aja. And they have a different business model now, which, as far as I knew at the time anyway, was about trying to capture sort of public transport customers instead of competing with these two companies. Maybe what maybe is unique about this is the amount of venture capital that they attracted. So they both became unicorns very quickly. Like there were 6 unicorns at that point, and Gojek was the first unicorn. So they attracted financing from Tencent, but also from Facebook, PayPal, Google. And so they had so much money to throw at incentivizing customers. So these cashbacks. And I think that is really what allowed them to tank the market for pretty much most of their competitors, to the point that OVO actually, which was owned by the Lippo Group, which owns this large mall consortium in Indonesia, and is one of the very wealthy families, they actually sold the majority ownership they had, I think, of OVO, because they could no longer afford to keep financing this sort of cash flow. So I think that might actually be a more accurate version of the answer to why they became so prominent. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So Gonzalo, you have the next question.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the talk. Very rich, and by the way, the artwork is amazing.
Yeah,
really,
I'm so happy with it.
Yeah, really nice. I have two questions. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask two questions. One is about political economy, and you are already answering a little bit to that question as you were addressing Yicham's concerns. One of my former MPhil students, Jack Xing, he wrote his dissertation on Didi, which is the most famous ride-hailing app in China. And one of the most remarkable things he shows is how, the growth of Didi went through a very long, well, about 10 years process of, what people in the industry call subsidization, right?
Mm-hmm.
The recruitment of customers, in which about $45 billion were invested between 2012 and 2018. And of course, part of that process of, capital investment and so on, involved an increasing internationalization of capital. So, companies like Apple, for example, were involved, and so on and so forth. So I was a bit curious to learn more. I don't know if you addressed this in your dissertation about this sort of political economy behind the hierarchies of servitude that you were talking about. So that's one question. I don't know if you want to address it now, and then I ask you a second question. Maybe it's easier this way.
Probably, if you want me to actually answer both of them, it's easier.
Okay. So, please go ahead.
Yeah, this was actually one of the most challenging things throughout the fieldwork. And if anyone has any really good ideas about how to research the economy of these companies, I would be very interested. I mean, I interviewed most of them, and I found it very difficult to talk to them about the finance. I found it easier to ask them to tell me about the other companies' financial structures. They had a lot of thoughts about their competitors. But one of the things I was told, first of all, was you're not going to get this kind of information because we're almost always, and here this particular respondent was speaking on behalf of the industry, was saying we're almost always up for a new IPO. So we're very protective of the specifics of our financial data. And so you're not going to get that kind of public information. So the best we have is sort of their own estimates or public announcements whenever they make, for example, this new bid, where they value their own contribution as, it's worth $40 billion, but I mean, who knows really? And they, in this, I can't remember what it was, but they actually also provide a statistic for their value to the GDP. So they're really putting it out there that they have meaning for society. So the investments, like I said, the capital investments have been going on for pretty much since Gojek's origin. I can't remember, I guess the first big round was around 2017. This is in the thesis, but I don't have it with me right here. And was mainly Google and Tencent, I think, at the time. Meanwhile, SoftBank, of course, has also invested in Grab. And therefore
American and Japanese money, yeah?
Yes. Yeah. And Saudi money as well, I think, is wrapped up in SoftBank. So it's hugely international. And I mean, I had one of the quotes, well, I'm not sharing the screen, so I can't show you, but WhatsApp, for example, the CEO of WhatsApp had a lot to say about Facebook's big investment and how this is going to help business to business. And they're going to bring financial inclusion to the people. So I find that all of these massive investments are always really layered in this kind of conversation about how great this is going to be for everyone, and especially the poor. What's also worth noting is a lot of that money is not just being spent on subsidizing consumers, it's also being spent on buying up smaller startups in Indonesia. So a lot of these big companies, I go over this in the thesis as well, have purchased a lot of smaller companies that are especially targeting, for example, what you would call the unbanked sector. So there's a pretty clear idea about who the next kind of target for the expansion of the service is going to be once they move out of just like urban centers. But also, of course, you know, financial infrastructure companies, things like that, that can help them facilitate these types of digital payments. So which ties us back to Yichen's earlier point, which is why I think they've been able to move so fast with the development of their financial services, because they've had this huge capital injection. And I think now that they've made this go-to consortium, at least, I think it's very noticeable that they chose to call it go-to, which is an English phrase. And they released an advertisement, which is in English, which is distinct from many of their other advertisements, which are in Indonesian with English subtitles. And they pitch a lot of like, for example, at one point, they make a lot of deal about the concept of gotong royong in Indonesia, which is a type of very, very poorly briefly summarized, a sort of moral labor that ensures that everyone contributes, for example, to, you know, tasks in the village. The important thing is it's unpaid labor, but they define it in this advertisement as, you know, the Indonesian spirit of working together. And so there's this like wholesale selling of Indonesia as an open marketplace, this like exotization of Indonesia to international investors, which I think is quite interesting. So it's not just these companies are worth investing in, it's Indonesia as a market for tech. You know, this new space for unicorns and for investment is what's being pitched internationally. So I think that's a really interesting development. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
That's great, yes. Can I ask another question, Yicchen, very quick? Yeah?
Yes,
so
yes.
This is a sort of more methodology, sort of STS/anthropology question, which I'm sure that probably you've been playing this question also around your head for quite some time. I mean, one of the things that I've learned, again, to refer to Jack's work from Jack, is that this literature on ride-hailing apps, I mean, the theme, these tensions of freedom is quite sort of recurrent. And the idea of, you know, the lure of free money and easiness and convenience then quickly turns into the prison of the algorithm kind of thing. You know, which we can imagine this being played out in places as different as Jakarta, Berlin, New York, Beijing, and so on.
Copenhagen.
And of course, within STS, probably the emphasis will be on kind of, you know, trying to unpack how these tensions work and so on and so forth. Whereas anthropology, which is sort of more attentive to context, right? To context, we'll be thinking about what could be, does it make a difference that these tensions are taking place in Indonesia as opposed to Germany or, you know, Beijing, China? You know, how does the context play into the hierarchies of servitude that you were talking about? I don't know if you thought about this question in your dissertation, if it's something that you're going to take into the future. Just that, so STS/anthropology.
Yeah. It's a great question, and it's actually something I also want to be writing about, like what I was saying to Yicchen before about this, like where these two apps emerged from that are quite embedded in Indonesian culture, like with mall and driving. Yeah, so first of all, I think there's some really interesting work that, I mean, my work has been largely about how the functionality of these payment systems, and has not been so oriented on like the driver culture itself. Even though I did interview, you know, I largely interviewed drivers, and I also visited a lot of what's called driver communities. And I have some extra slides on this actually, but this is the fun of online presentation. But so one thing that's really interesting in Indonesia, which I would really recommend the work of, oh my goodness, now her name is completely eluding me, Rita Kadri, who is at MIT and has just finished her fieldwork and is, I think, writing up her dissertation now on specifically on driver communities in Indonesia. So her work is more specifically oriented around the politics of that form of organization. And one really interesting observation that she makes, and which my research also supports, I think, is that what distinguishes sort of, in my experience, the Indonesian drivers from other places that I've encountered them, such as in Denmark or in the US, is that where a lot of the literature that's been coming out of the West focuses on how this type of technology atomizes the labor force, what's interesting in Indonesia is actually that you have this strong sense of community. So when I was in the US for my research abroad exchange at UCI, I went in a Lyft drive and I asked the driver, so where do you hang out with the drivers? And he looked at me like I had asked the most absurd question he'd ever heard, because he was like, I don't hang out with other drivers. Like, they're not my friends. And it seems so strange to me because in Indonesia, what you'll see everywhere is that people hang out, right? You'll see them in the green jackets, not just set up on the street sides or in like food stalls, but they have physically built up base camps that they all contribute to financially. And where they have really elaborate infrastructures for supporting each other financially, emotionally. If someone has an accident on the road, they have very extensive like WhatsApp networks that they can communicate to each other through to get help. And this provides a very interesting contradiction to the way we've normally seen how these apps kind of function. Now, whether or not I mean, there are still a lot of negative side effects, because I would argue that even though these are forms of resistance that I think are interesting, and I have a lot more in my thesis about like active resistance towards these systems that I didn't have time to go into today. And even though there's a lot of methods for resistance or technologies of resistance that are being circulated in these communities, I think it's also important maybe to be critical of the extent to which that actually exerts influence. Because it's very, it's tempting also to champion the underdogs in the situation and be like, look at all these ways people are resisting, but these technologies are incredibly repressive and have a lot of power to put behind these forms of repression. And what I found, at least, is that, drivers will innovate ways to get around these systems. So like a really good example would be, so if a driver cancels, as I mentioned, they get a negative productivity rate, and that can affect their ability to earn a bonus. So what you would often get is the drivers would call you and ask you to please cancel the booking, because it doesn't affect you if it's the customer who does it. So what does the app do? Eventually, they figure out drivers are doing this. And I mean, there are many reasons why drivers might cancel, right? There's a lot of good reasons for doing so. And you would think that a flexible labor force, flexible gig economy, you should be able to choose when you do or do not complete an assignment. But what the app does then is introduce a system where if you, the customer, cancels, a little pop-up appears that says, did the driver ask you to cancel? And if you click that, well, then it will still affect the driver negatively.
Put them here, yeah.
Yeah, and that's just one example, right, of all the ways in which it seems as if these drivers are constantly kind of at war with the app, and they keep having to respond to each other because these technologies are not static. And much more elaborate ones, like this whole change of the hierarchies of servitude, as I call them, these like scales, are also a response to the fact that drivers would take their trips offline. So they would call customers and say, hey, I'll come pick you up. Let's do the trip offline, because that way you'll pay the same, but I'll get to keep the 20% the app was going to take. And so, of course, if they do that, then, Gojek loses money. And so one way to mitigate that is to make it so that the amount of completed trips can affect you for several weeks afterwards, which means you definitely don't want to take your trips offline. So, I mean, I am speculating here, but I would assume that this is one response. I mean, there's probably multiple reasons, but it's definitely also a response to the fact that drivers were using this as a sort of offline booking arrangement. Yeah, so anyway, point being, I think there's some really interesting things to look at, both in terms of how these apps arose out of the Indonesian context and the types of servitude we have there. We have a pembantu culture. You have narratives of like kin within those servant relationships that I think are also, worth being unpacked, because those are also complicated kin relationships. You are a part of the family, but you live in the back of the house, sort of things like that. And I think there's definitely ways you could look into how those types of moral are also reproduced inside of these technologies. And I saw some of that. I mean, I also interviewed consumers of the apps, and I go into that in the thesis, the way that they react to and engage with these drivers, sort of what rights they feel they have over their lives and livelihoods, I think is also quite interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I will follow up with Lorita's question in the chat box, and then we have June to ask questions. I think Lorita's question is also about driver, but I think it will be more interesting. So she was wondering how the drivers would respond to your theorization of peer.
Yes. So I just maybe want to ask a follow-up question to Lorita, so whether or not they would respond to the kind of the use of the term peer, or like how they would respond to my critique of
the critique. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think it's first of all important to be clear that like the word peer is not one that is from the field, right? This is something that often like these companies are described as being P2P. It's not something that drivers would ever say about this relationship. So that's the first thing. I think that I also don't, yeah, exactly. That's what I wondered. Exactly. No, that's not a word that emerges in the field. And I think the closest word you have for peer in Indonesian would be something like kawan sebaya, which would roughly translate to something like a similar friend or a friend who has like similar characteristics or age to you. But it's not, again, it's not like, it would be weird to use that phrase. I think it would be more common for people just to say peer, frankly, as like an English word in this context. I think they would probably react with it because when I was interviewing them, I was trying to use similar words, but like the partner thing and trying to investigate. So without using the word peer, talk about the sort of qualities imbued in the concept of peer and within this transaction. And one of the things that was most prominent for them had to do with sort of how equality was being defined or undefined within these transactional relationships. So, for example, they would frequently say things like, well, they were in a symbiosis with the company, but, you know, one which mainly took advantage of them because they were, you know, using the apps as individuals, whereas the company saw them as a fleet. And then in relation to customers, they would often describe how, because the customers are so empowered with like rating mechanisms and cancellations and reporting mechanisms, they were always put in a position of being subservient. And they also felt that this was reinforced by the apps because of the way that the interface itself is set up. So I showed one image at some point, for example, where there's like a picture of a driver who's like happily dreaming of servicing customers. And it says like, our drivers can't wait to serve you. And there's as if this like constant language of the apps puts drivers in this role of servitude, which is then reproduced by customers. And so drivers would find that customers, for example, would be like, well, even though the app has given you this like set route, which you're being paid for by the kilometer, I would like you also to take me to the ATM. And if you don't, I'll report you, or like, I'll, you know, give you a 1-star rating. And so they're effectively kind of captured. And as one of them put it, he felt like they were just seen as this automated extension, right? He literally said, we're being treated as robots. They completely forget that we have lives. And because the service is so cheap, it's also being undervalued by everyone who's using it. And so for them, I'm pretty sure that they would disagree with the idea that there was any type of peer relationship involved here. So I do also want to mitigate that with one statement, which is just to say, like, not all drivers are equal. Again, right? Like I pointed out, what the digital economy looks like depends on where you're coming at it from. And so there's a huge difference between drivers who are living day by day and who need to cash out every day, and drivers for whom it's a bit of a freelance gig and for whom that kind of thing doesn't matter so much. And many of those drivers would say, well, I just love this. It's great. It's good for my free time. I get to practice speaking English with foreign customers. I get to meet a lot of people. And for others, it was clearly a really stressful kind of like, get out of my car. I'm already getting the next order as you're leaving, you know? So it's just, there's also not a homogenous group here, which I think is important to say as well. Like, we can break down the sort of P2P of it all, but it's also really important to break down the idea that these are two sort of homogenous groups, on both sides, right? Customers are not all the same and the drivers are not all the same, and how they experience this transactional arrangement also changes depending on their starting point, which I think the concept also obscures. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really brilliant answer. And then our next question goes to Jun.
Hi,
Hi.
thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Just one very brief comment when you just say that, you know, there's no community building in a lot of the like Ubers and that kind of apps. Actually, it all depends. Uber is just like one of the very many car ride sharing apps. Sherry Gibbons' work. She's the one of the editors in Cities and Society. Mm-hmm. One of her research actually looked at one of these car ride-sharing apps developed in a community in somewhere, I forgot the name, in Canada, mostly by women. They cool. Actually use Facebooks and so on. There's a lot of community emotional support for sure, actually to help women, I think, to give mostly right for women in a very impoverished neighborhood with a lot of physical dangers for women to go home, especially at night. So a lot of the rides actually happen at night. So there's a lot of emotional work and also community building work between drivers, but also between drivers and customers. I mean, passengers, possibly is the better word. So I think there's actually quite diverse and depends on what kind of companies you're talking about. Or, you know, it could be car sharing without these kind of big corporations, investment, banking involved in that process. So possibly, I think that will be something just to look into. A question. So the other one is the questions. I'm always intrigued by digital payment. Whoever come up with the idea of digital payment, how do they make money out of digital payment system? I know how the China, for example, for WeChat, I know how they can actually make money out of it. But the key for that is actually not to have people cash out. You want people to cash out as late as possible. So then the top up actually is very counterintuitive, because once you top up, you sort of cash out the money. You use the driver as a ATM, then you are cashing out. So once you're cashing out, how are you going to keep the money within the system? And so to make money out of it, because like, for example, the WeChat, by basically think about the WeChat, what it does is WeChat, when it actually do digital payment, it didn't even have a financial license. That's why it got later get into a little bit of trouble. The way how they actually get money is, for example, everyone, so you use your card, top up money in your own account, pay, as long as the money stay within that digital, stay with WeChat account, people don't cash it out, put it back to their bank account. Those money sort of in accounting books, they belong to
the company.
So you can use it basically as interest-free loan. So think about it just by saving the interest. So we are not even talking about the financial instruments that they created later on. Just by not paying the interest, they already have a huge amount of cash for their use, for, you know, moving money around here and there. It's already a lot of financial gains. So in that case, in the Grab case, and, you know, in collaboration with Oval, I don't quite see where they can actually make money. If there's a political economy there, where's the economy?
Yeah, great question. And I have some thoughts. But first of all, I agree. It is super, super interesting how they make money in all of this. And I just want to make one clarification, just to be clear, because when I talk about the top up, I mean, they're doing exactly that. They're not cashing out of the app, right? They are giving customers cash money to receive a digital balance. And then the drivers,
you still give the cash money out. So in the WeChat case, there's no cash involved. There's no cash.
Right. But this is a system where most people are not using digital payments otherwise, right? So they're not in the banking system. They're not used to. So even though there's an increasing amount of people that have debit cards and so on, most transactions, like, for example, if I were to buy an airplane ticket in Indonesia, I might go online and make a purchase. And then I would go down to the local kiosk and I would have a code and a time limit, and I would pay cash for my airplane ticket and then get a confirmation email. So within that system, this is already quite a big innovation to get cash transferred into digital credits. And once it's there, so once you top up with the driver, so you give the driver cash and the driver gives you his digital balance and now also has cash. The idea that you kind of, the longer you can keep, so then the driver might also, you know, they also are interested in the drivers not cashing out of the system through their bank account, but to keep selling it back to customers, because each time they do that, you know, the driver receives cash and then sends digital balance to the customer, but it keeps that digital balance moving within the system. It doesn't leave, especially if the driver is just reselling it instead of taking it out. So I think that's, first of all, their innovation. But to add to that, I sometimes wonder, because so the companies get, at least when I was doing the research, they got a 20% on top of any cash payments that were made, not digital payments, which means that the driver always only receives 80% of the cost of a trip. If it's cash, the driver, you know, they receive obviously 100%, and then the driver owes the company 20%, which they have get withdrawn from their credit account. If it's digital, the driver just receives 80%, end of story. So they're already there. You're incentivizing customers to make digital payments, right? because you're foregoing your amount of the money. But because of the way these things are so heavily subsidized, I'm not convinced that they're making any money at all. I mean, verified by the fact that OVO had to sell a large part of, or Lipo had to sell a large part of what they owned in OVO. I wonder whether or not the real business model, I mean, I'm not even sure what the capacity is for actually handling all of this transactional metadata. I would love to see someone actually explore that in more depth, but I wonder if a large part of it actually is quite speculative and is about advancing the idea of the potential profitability of these companies to keep securing venture capital, and whether that is in fact the real business model here. That the real final ultimate cash out is when they leave the company, you know, like to put it in those phrasing. And I mean, the CEO, the founder of the company, Gojek at least, he has gone on now to become a minister in the cabinet, Minister of Culture and Education, I believe. So there are other forms of cashing in your capital for other forms of social capital happening here as well. But I mean, I don't know this for sure. What I found was it was very, very difficult to explore like the real business case behind these things. And I mean, I would speculate based on what we also know from similar companies that the transactional metadata is what's considered specifically valuable. At least it's what everyone seems to be chasing these days, is financial transactional metadata. Whether it really has this value, interesting to see. I mean, I don't know. I'm not convinced.
Well,
Yeah.
one way was to, I think one of the digital platform economy literature says the business model is basically what is the Chinese call is that 流量就是it's all about the volume of transaction. It's not about how much you can keep. It's all about the volume.
Yes.
Although there are more and more research that points out that business model just doesn't work. So yes, the way how you can make money out of it is mostly either selling it as a startup company, selling it to big corporation who are willing to take over. That is a one way. Go public is another way. But I think the China one actually is making money.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, June. I'm sorry, it wasn't. Sorry to meddle here. With $45 billion on Didi, let's not talk about WeChat because
no. I'm not talking about Didi, Gonzalo. I'm not talking about. No, Gonzalo. I'm not talking about Didi.
As the host, I have to remind you that it's.
Yeah, I'm just saying that the business model is not following.
I'm not talking about Didi. I'm talking about WeChat. I'm not talking about Didi, Gonzalo. I'm talking about digital payment. I'm not talking about the share riding.
Anyway, to just put the comment on what Sunniva said that I thought was very, very interesting about what is actually being achieved here, and I wonder about the information of customers. You know, I'm sure that they are collecting a massive database on customers as well as drivers. And I'm sure as well that, you know, in the world of capitalism today, that must have a lot of value, I mean, economic value. So that certainly is part of what is being produced here.
So I think this goes back to what you were saying before, June, about like the business model here, because I think, one thing is whether or not the transactional metadata for all of its like glorification has real value, but I do think that like one business model that they could choose to go, and I don't know if this is what was the case in your example, Jun, but they could go kind of the Google, Facebook route, which involves like packaging this data and selling it out to advertisers or things like that, like monetizing the data in that way. And I mean, I do see the fact that, you know, our tech friends are there, right? Google, Facebook, PayPal, they're all already invested. So whether or not they're about to bring their expertise to this or whether they expect to get something out of it through their involvement, I mean, it would certainly be indicative that some of those existing business models could also be being reproduced here eventually, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have a comment that helps us answer that question from Chris. So Chris said that, you know, actually none of the live streaming apps in China were in the black, which means that they're living off money from the investors.
I'm pretty sure it's the same thing.
Yeah, especially for startups, I think it's more like burning the money and then get new. It's like a scam or something.
Yes, and I do think there's also an important point to be made here, which is that at least when I was doing this research, as a customer, the only thing you need to register for this platform is a phone number and an email address. And let's be clear, people in Asia already change their phone numbers all the time because it comes with, for example, well, it's getting less frequent now because they changed the rules for SIM cards, but it's not difficult to change your phone number or your email address and therefore have all of the data on your person disappear if you change your account. It's only drivers who have to register with their formal identification. And it's only if you as a customer want to upgrade to access services such as having a higher balance or being able to take your money out of the system again, that you have to provide your government issued ID, right? So like the stakes there are a little bit different. And I mean, I think one thing that's really, really important to keep in mind that I took away from this as well is like, we see how the drivers sign terms and conditions, much like customers do, to participate and use this apps and to be have access to this economy. I think it's critical to understand that there's no reason to believe that this will not also be applicable to consumers. That the way that these app platforms are cheap and accessible and require very little kind of boundaries to access, that's for now. But there's no reason to believe that the terms and conditions of participating will not become more hostile. And we see now, for example, at Uber in the US, I think suddenly it's become very expensive for customers to use them. But at the same time, you've undermined public transport and people have gotten so used to these services that they find themselves with limited options. So those are also potential business models, right? Capture everyone now so that you have all of the transactional metadata monopolized, but you also have the customer base monopolized so that eventually, maybe long-term, it'll be profitable. And I'm sure that's what they're promising their investors, which are probably the short-term business model.
Just off the record, how many on-demand drivers do you think there are in Indonesia working for?
This is a bit hard to say. I mean, when I was there, it was certainly over 1 million. And I mean, for sure, it's
drivers.
Oh yeah. I'm quite sure about that. I mean, off the record, I would have to verify 100%, but it does say somewhere in my thesis. I think I do talk about it. But there's certainly very, very many. And if you look, I mean, if you wanted to get a clue about the number of consumers, which I haven't been able to find public stats about, you could look, for example, at Google Play Store and see how many millions of downloads it's had, the app. And you could do the same for the driver version of the app, which also exists there as a methodological tweak.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we are almost there. And I'll just take this opportunity to ask the audience if there's any quick question, or else I will think that we will thank Sunniva. Sorry.
One last comment.
Yeah.
Okay, so this whole thing about living off the investors' money, right? So it reminds me of this concept by Anna Tsing. She came up with the idea of the economy of appearances.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, in order to become successful, you first put up a front that you appear to be successful, then invite people to invest you in, people to invest money in you in order to make that success a reality.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I bet that's exactly what's happening here with the China live streaming app and with Gojek in Indonesia.
Yeah. I would be quite confident in saying something similar is happening. And I mean, in the meantime, of course, real money is being transacted and real people's lives are being affected, also in very negative ways in many cases.
Yeah.
Which is sort of second tier, apparently, to all of this. But I agree with you. I think a lot of it is about selling the idea of success, which is also why I think it's so interesting with this. And I recommend you all to go and look up Gojek's new advertisement for GoTo. Because it's a masterclass in the economy of appearances, as you explained, in terms of like pitching, again, not just, I would argue, not just the company, but like Indonesia as a marketplace for investment, because investments there collectively will be good for the tech class and for those who are already involved in the sector. I also think it's interesting, just sub-comment to that, but they went with GoTo rather than they had a bunch of public marketing campaigns about how they should combine the two names, I guess. And one of the things that most of Indonesian Twitter was going on about was they should have really have gone with, so it was like Gojek and Tokopedia. And people were going, why didn't you call it Tokek, which means like gecko, which would have been like a very Indonesian kind of like apropos culture and anthropology, like an Indonesian kind of name instead of going with GoTo. And of course, I think the obvious answer is we're thinking outside of Indonesia here in terms of who's going to be buying this product, with the product being the entire like economy of appearances, as you say.
Right. Okay. Yeah. All right. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you for coming and for your comments. I really appreciate it. I've taken a lot of notes. I really look forward to exploring it more. And especially thank you for the, I really want to say thanks to Jun for the comment about the example from Canada. I really look forward to reading about that.
Okay, let's give a final applause to Sunniva today. I think it's a wonderful talk and we have really benefited from it.
Thank you. Okay, thanks for inviting me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So Gonzalo, do you want to say anything for the next seminar or something? Do we have any information on that?
I actually
Sorry, Gonzalo, you're on
have the
mute.
list here with
Yeah.
me.
Okay.
But do you actually have the list with you, Ichan? Sorry.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we'll come
So
back
let's
with
just thank
Yeah.
Sunniva for this wonderful talk. Yes, thank you very
Okay.
much. And I'll see you in our next webinar. Check out our social networks, Facebook. Thank you and see you again.
See you.
Oh, just a very quick one. I'm not sure Sherry actually has published her work, or maybe you just email her. You can find her name. Because I saw the draft of her paper.
Yeah.
You can email her if you can't find anything published yet.
Thank you so much. I'm writing it down right now. I can say I spelled it wrong when you said it before, so I'm glad you wrote the clarification. All right. Thank you so much, and take care, everyone. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Nice day.